Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Tom, first for the invitation and secondly for recognizing the Pacific. We always worry when people say Asia and the Pacific because we know what happens, we get drowned out. So thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you this morning. I'm a month 2 into the job, so I'm allowed to make some mistakes and ask silly questions. I have colleagues in the audience, I'm sure they'll cringe and tell me off afterwards, but I'm going to push ahead and share with you my own observations at this point in time. I hope to be a little bit provocative, some of the stuff you've heard before. So I want to acknowledge that my colleagues, some in the room, Patricia, Sachs, Cornish, Aquila, Gerald, Cameron, Shelton, Mike and Paula. I thought I'd cover these things in the time that I have. Just a little bit of context. What I see as our development challenges, a little bit about SPC itself, and perhaps some observations and suggestions on the G20 at the end. I have 2 fundamental questions. First and most important in my mind is what is an appropriate level of development in the Pacific? My sense of it, having been in the region for a long time, is this relentless push for economic development for big and small. And I'm just not sure whether that's the right approach. There are variations in size, variations in capability, and indeed variations in development potential. And secondly, I think there's a lot of money spent in the region. I'll come to that in a bit. How do we get more value out of that money? And given the opportunity, I thought I might provoke the G20 to think about how we might do things differently. Do we have the right and most appropriate architecture for development in the region? Big ocean, from Pitcairn, all 54 of them to the east, Pitcairn Islanders, and to Palau in the west. And hopefully this year, sometime soon, we'll be able to admit Timor-Leste into the SPC family. Big ocean, small islands. It is our defining feature, though, the Pacific Ocean. It is the world's largest ecosystem and a major social, economic, spiritual, and cultural lifeline for Pacific people. And out of the ocean, 2 big activities thus far. One is tuna. Don't hold me too much to the numbers, that's what I'm told. Big numbers. Unfortunately for the region, they're getting peanuts back. Some would say, well, actually, it's not too bad now. It's about 10% because a year or so ago it was only 5%. I still think, and I'd ask why is it that of the $3 to $4 billion estimated catch in 2012 at $7 billion, that there's only about 250, 300 million returned to the Pacific. It's a big question. Tourism obviously is a big one. Not going to talk too much about that today. And the one that everyone seems to be excited about at the moment is deep sea minerals. Hopefully I'll have some time to talk about that. But the thing that's really important from my point of view is the ocean, the coastal ecosystems, the source of livelihood, such as reefs, mangroves, the very source, the very resource that offers Pacific cultures, the source of livelihood. It's a big number. But paradise is under threat. There's overfishing, there's climate change, there's habitat destruction, there's pollution, you name it. If you forget what I tell you today, I just want to remind you that people from the outside talk about the Pacific as if there's just one homogeneous group. It is a region of contrast. The population is in Melanesia, approximately 90%. And it's mostly water. And so in terms of this contrast, you have to ask, what is a realistic level of development? What can we expect to do? Clearly, Melanesia has the resource, the land, the people. Most of the mineral deposits, I'm told, and most of the tuna. So on that basis, I assume that that's probably where development is its most promising. But I'm not sure what we can expect for the most part in Micronesia and in Polynesia. There are places like Samoa and Tonga, of course, who are a bit bigger, but they're very small islands. Just some brief background. Melanesia, as I said, I know some people think that the subgrouping of Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia is a bit passé, an old hat. I still think it's a useful way to think about things. So if you look at Melanesia, it's where the people are. It's where life expectancy is not the greatest. It's where maternal mortality remains high. And for the most part, GDP per capita is low. In Micronesia, smaller numbers of population, better life expectancies, somewhat better infant mortality rates, and again, GDP per capita is a bit better. Polynesia is probably where it's most promising. Smaller numbers, best life expectancy, nowhere near what's possible, of course, and indeed GDP per capita are better. So overall, perhaps the area of most need is Melanesia. We need to remember there's some very small places here, very small places. Tuvalu, for example, there's only 26 square kilometers. It's tiny. I mean, you actually have to ask yourself, what can you expect out of this? What can you really do in a place of this size? Nauru the same. My own little place, at least it's got land, hasn't got people. But again, I would ask, what is a realistic and reasonable level of development appropriate for Niue, for example? There's a lot of money spent in the region. This is some receipts back in 2001 on per capita spend in the region. As you can see, the Pacific, $237 US per head that year. The closest is Africa, under $40. So you have to ask yourself, where's the money? What's happened to the money? So even if you said take some to allow for the cost of communication and transport, you'd still left with quite a lot of money. So I'm wondering, so where is the money? What have we achieved with the money? I'm concerned about that. And of course, there's all these mechanisms around in terms of assessing where the money has gone, how effective aid is and has been. There are these global agreements and regional agreements that help us to assess effectiveness. But I think the problem is probably to do with implementation, or lack of it, and the current architecture that we have in order to deliver these programs. In other words, do we have the right architecture? Is what we have at the present time a good platform for delivering aid in the region, aid with impact? A little short piece now about SPC. We've been around 67 years. In this day and age, longevity must tell you that we've done something right. Australia has been a key figure in this history. We are moderately large by Pacific standards, involved in some 20-odd sectors. Some people say, well, it's too big, too broad, how can you possibly be effective? That is a point of view, not lost on us. But again, on the converse of that is that it does position us, I think, to be able to approach some of the issues like NCDs, food security, and so on, more effectively. Our problem is we're largely project funded. We get some generous person give us some money, we run the program for 2 or 3 years, and then it's all over, everybody has to go home, and we start again on something else. It's not the best way to support development. And we're working through that with our partners. 7 divisions from economic development, transport and energy. Fisheries, of course, is the mainstay, or at least a program that's been part of SPC for a very long time. Land resources, forestry and agriculture, and so on. The one unique feature I should mention is statistics for development is an important part of our work. There are not many credible sources of information and statistics in the region. And SPC has been a provider of statistics for some years now. I'm very cynical about global organizations, international organizations producing figures for this part of the world. I'll just talk now a bit more about SPC itself. What we do as a development agency, of course, is to try and build capacity. That's easier said than done. We need to remember the slide I showed you of the very small islands. There is no hope, and no sense in thinking about capacity development in those small places. Somebody, somewhere, needs to provide essential services for those small places, I think, for a very long time. And SPC has been doing some of that. I think we need to be explicit about that, instead of trying to pretend that we can get small places to be independent and to be able to deliver the full range of what we expect a good government to provide for its citizens. I think that's a point that's worth thinking about, because I think we've been a little lost in this desire to develop everybody, this one size fits everyone approach. What are the big development challenges for us in the region? One is the political landscape is changing. The peaceful, quiet, sleepy neighborhood is no longer the case. Subgroupings have come to the fore. The Melanesian Spearhead Group you would have heard of, the Polynesian Leaders Group and so on. So there's clearly, in addition to this Pacific Island Forum, which has been around for a while, there's new expression of identity and leadership in the region. And the most recent and the most challenging, of course, is the Pacific Island Development Forum promoted by Fiji last year. Where all this is going, no one knows. For our part, of course, we don't have the luxury of choosing between one or the other, and we have to navigate these difficult waters as best we can. Population growth remains one of our big challenges. The total fertility rate in many parts of the Pacific remains high, and in some places, South Tarawa comes to mind, and places in Micronesia. Why is this important? It is important because if you look at opportunities and potential, it's not that great. And when you have young people, unemployment in the Marshall Islands, I'm told, is up around 70%. When you're young and unemployed, and without a sense of purpose and hope, what do? So population remains one of our big challenges. And economically, of course, you would know more about this than I do. Very volatile, small economies, very limited opportunities in capital. Distance, cost of communication and transport. And the big one for me personally, having come from with a health background, is diabetes and heart disease. My predecessor, Jimmy, told people once that you don't need to worry about climate change because that's a long time away, and you might not even be impacted by climate change because diabetes and/or heart disease will kill you before then. Seriously, it is one of our biggest problems in this part of the world. Costs to health systems are unsustainable. You cannot talk about development when your most productive age groups are affected one way or the other by an NCD. And then, of course, we have this rather curious phenomenon currently running, and that is the old dengue. Instead of popping up every 3 or 4 years, it's constantly around at the present time and present in many places all at once. Highly unusual. And then, of course, now we have lots of motor vehicles and lots of alcohol, and that's a lethal combination yet to be recognized as a public health challenge in this region. On the economic side, high debt, mostly external debt, heavy reliance on foreign aid and remittances, and not very strong governance regulatory environments. And I'm told that there's too much government involved in unsustainable borrowing practices to prop up big dreams, but inefficient enterprises. Communications and technology, you can't talk about kids participating in the modern society when you have 2% of the population of Papua New Guinea have access to the internet. And then, of course, the big ones, climate change. We are particularly vulnerable in this part of the world. It's completely demoralizing after the cyclone goes through Tonga. You have to start again. Many of these places don't get insurance, can't get insurance. So when a cyclone or a natural disaster takes place and takes out your infrastructure, you're back to square one, and quite often back to minus square one. Recent World Bank report tells us mostly what we know, that poverty and hardship is a major issue in the region. Not the poverty that you generally hear about, because people generally can access food without relying too much on money, but nonetheless there's no social protection, and families rely very much on their own in times of crisis as a safety net. And then, of course, given the large volumes of food import and fuel import in the region, the island communities are very vulnerable to economic shocks. I've just talked a little bit about this, where the top 8 of the top 20 countries with the highest average annual GDP loss from disasters are in the Pacific. And so the environment and environmental sustainability is, of course, a big issue for us. But here's the biggie. We used to be concerned about kids not going to school in the region. They are in school. That's the good news. The bad news is that 7 out of those 10 children who are in school and have been in school for 6 years are not meeting what people regard as the learning objectives. So in other words, we're not starting in a good place. How can you talk about improved health or development or wealth creation when your building blocks are not there? We don't have a specific mandate for education in the region, and I suspect it's one of these issues that highlights my point about too many players and nobody's responsible. And here's a pretty powerful indication of the situation with regard to education and investment for our future. And somehow we've got to look at this and think about how we might approach it differently. I can't believe when people gave me this that 7 million of the 10 million people in the Pacific don't have access to electricity. So when you have no power for a couple of days and you think you're having a bad day, think about these folk in the region. And beyond this, how can you talk about development and investment when the building blocks are not there? On the good side, the countries have committed to fairly ambitious targets for renewable energy based at the Forum Leaders meeting last year in the Marshall Islands. On the forestry side, Fiji exports mainly value-added products and receives 4 times the value for the equivalent amount of log. Solomons, Papua New Guinea and Vanuatu sends green logs overseas, and it was estimated that they would have gained $578 million to $1 billion in lost value from exporting green logs. And here is a good illustration of what happens in the region. Deep sea minerals, a lot of promise, a lot of excitement, and a lot of promises, perhaps with quite grandiose estimates. I guess when you have limited opportunities, you're going to get excited about issues like this. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to skip through this and go to my last point. G20 and the opportunity. My understanding is that G20 was established to promote stable and sustainable growth, economic growth that benefits all. And development is clearly a key component. But my reading of the literature is that people asking questions about its effectiveness. So words like diffuse, lacking coherence, too broad, disconnected, episodic, informal, ineffective were frequent. And so I asked myself, what is the role of G20 in development? And particularly, what is the role of G20 in this part of the world? And I would have thought that for an organization like G20, that perhaps identifying an issue of systemic significance to small islands, where regional or sub-regional approach or regional action is needed. For example, NCDs, climate change financing, the post-2015 development agenda. And I've put in there youth participation and employment, perhaps, for the reasons I've outlined before. And specifically, given my concern about the number of players in this part of the world, whether in fact G20 should focus on better cooperation between international and regional organizations. I have to say that I think that there are part of the reason why that ODA allocation to the region, the impact is limited, is probably because there are too many of us with bureaucracies to feed. Should we think about revising the development architecture for this part of the world? Perhaps a new agenda after the post-2015 agenda with a clear focus on the unique needs of small island states in this part of the world. Is it conceivable to reallocate some of the money that's been spent by international organizations for activities closer to home, with organizations that have impact, and particularly for implementation effectiveness at the country level? I also think that perhaps the G20 might think seriously about more support and dialogue with non-members. And I would note that indeed in this part of the world, Australia has a key role in that. And I personally think that critical thinking, thought leadership, political influence might be a contribution from our G20 leaders. And I personally think that perhaps a better focus on some meaningful accountability arrangements and measures and reporting of those publicly might help us to move this agenda on. So Australia, perhaps highlight the Pacific. During your turn as the presidency and small island states more broadly, focus perhaps on the post-2015 agenda, on the health of the oceans, possibly NCDs, but that might be a bridge too far, given the heavy reliance on economic, or heavy influence of economic and free trade of food on the incidence of NCDs in this part of the world. Perhaps even a binding treaty on climate change, and perhaps some issues beyond aid like labour mobility, gender equity, and possibly inequality. So let me finish there by saying that I think clearly some progress has been made. There's good potential in some of the big islands in Melanesia. I think there's a lot of money spent on development in this part of the world. Possibly too many players, too many members of the orchestra without a conductor, and not enough impact. No agreement on roles. And you know, people say, oh, we don't compete. Yeah, like I came down in the last shower. Competition for resources, regardless of what people will say to you, from the same 5 DAX countries in this part of the world. I think there's regional and international confusion about who does what, and inadequate accountability for results. I think there's a responsibility perhaps to refocus on this, reduce the focus on money, and focus on the big development challenges of small islands, and agree a way forwards on achieving better development outcomes. Thank you very much.